In the Philippines, about 14 to 17 million of the total population are indigenous people belonging to 110 ethno-linguistic groups, mainly concentrated in northern Luzon, which is about 33%, and in Mindanao, 61%, with few groups in the Visayas area. The Philippine indigenous people struggle for land and life underline that many of these indigenous people can be found in remote, forested, and hilly uplands. Some have also stood their ground successfully and maintained a close link with their ancestral past. Thus, the Department of Education accepted a great challenge to preserve this culture of our indigenous people by innovating and contextualizing education. I am Ryan Lucena, and my topic is all about curriculum innovation, indigenous curriculum. And I will discuss the IKSP or the Indigenous Knowledge System and Practices and Contextualizing Education, the IP education. The IKSPs, Indigenous Knowledge Systems and Practices, are local knowledge developed over centuries of experimentation and are passed orally from generation to generation. It was found to be an important catalyst to sustainable development due to their direct connection to resource management and conservation. Why indigenous knowledge systems and practices important? To instill and preserve the indigenous people systems and practices for younger indigenous people generation, to help us realize that there are different ways of viewing the world and gaining knowledge about indigenous people culture and practices, to protect an endangered way of life, and to learn from indigenous people perspective and knowledge. Policies and guidelines concerning indigenous people education. DepEd Order Number 62 Series of 2011 adopting the National Indigenous People or IP Education Policy Framework. This policy was prepared in consultation with the representatives from indigenous people community, civil society, and other government agencies. This policy framework is intended to be an instrument for promoting shared accountability, continuous dialogue, engagement, and partnership among government, IP communities, civil society, and other education stakeholders. Recognize education as necessary means to realize other human rights and fundamental freedoms, strengthen the depth of its policy on IP education, and develop and implement an IP education program. The policy is anchored with the Department of Education mandate, Education for All. Thus, the policy shall maintain an education statement that will recognize, protect, and promote the rights and welfare of ICCs and IPs, equip the IP communities with the knowledge and skills needed to face various social realities and challenges. IP education interventions are to be developed and implemented in consultation and cooperation with IPs concerning in order to address and incorporate their special needs, histories, identities, languages, knowledge, and other aspects of their culture as well as their social, economic, and cultural priorities and aspirations. Ensure the provisions of universal and equitable access of all IPs to quality and relevant basic education services towards functional literacy for all. Adopt appropriate basic education pedagogy, consent and assessment through the integration of indigenous knowledge systems and practices in all learning areas and process. Provide adequate and culturally appropriate learning resources and environmental to IP learners. Establish and strengthen appropriate multi-level units for planning, implementing, and monitoring IP education interventions. DepEd Order number 62 series of 2011 are focused on the major areas of the national education system: access to education services, pedagogy content and assessment, learning facilities and environment, teachers and learning facilitators, institutional support for the Indigenous Peoples Education Program, linkage and partnership for Indigenous people education, and eradication of discrimination. The DepEd Order number 32 series of 2015 adopting the Indigenous Peoples Education Curriculum Framework. Pursuant to DepEd Order number 62 series of 2011 entitled Adopting the National Indigenous Peoples Education or IPED Policy Framework and DepEd Order number 43 series of 2013 entitled Implementing Rules and Regulations of Republic Act number 10533, otherwise known as the Enhanced Basic Education Act of 2013. The Department of Education is adopting the enclosed Indigenous Peoples Education Curriculum Framework, recognizing the right of Indigenous people to basic education that is culturally rooted and responsive. The IPED curriculum framework seeks to provide guidance to schools and other education programs, both public and private, as they engage with indigenous communities in localizing, indigenizing, and enhancing the K-12 curriculum based on the respective educational and social contexts. Fundamental to IPED is establishing institutionalized partnership between indigenous communities and the respective schools or learning programs which serve them. This is to be pursued through sustainable community engagements, which guarantees the meaningful participation of indigenous communities in the inclusion of their indigenous knowledge systems and practices and indigenous learning systems in the basic education curriculum. The continuous process of community engagement and refinement of the IPED curriculum at the school community level actualizes the department's commitment to the attainment of the above mentioned rights of indigenous peoples to education. In this regard, for schools and learning programs serving indigenous learners, the aim of the K-12 program are realized through IPED. The iPad curriculum framework was formulated based on inputs from a series of consultations conducted by the DepEd Indigenous Peoples Education Office with community elders, leaders, and implementers of community-based iPad initiatives. On a Facebook post of Sir Jovin Ryan Malita of Schools Division of South Cotabato posted last April 2, 2022 explained how IP education being contextualized. Indigenous People Education or IPED is an education that is reflective of the IP's life, responsive to their needs and relevant in keeping their communities as it should be. This is contextualizing education. How contextualization is done. The contextualization is performed by harmonizing the indigenous learning competencies with the national competencies. Of course, the latter is non-negotiable and must be taught to the IP learners. Technically, the national competencies and the indigenous learning competencies shall interface. It is crucial to identify meeting points for harmonization to be done. Where do indigenous learning competencies come from? The indigenous learning competencies are based from the community life cycle and the seasons of life among indigenous peoples in the indigenous cultural community. This was the reason why the school's division offices or SDOs formulate the division IPED framework. The framework shall serve as a guide in coming up with indigenous learning competencies. It contains the IP community profile, ICC served, type of people, and their indigenous knowledge systems and practices. I have already discussed about IKSPS. This is a very broad subject to discuss. But in general view, the indigenous knowledge systems and practices are everything about the indigenous people. Everything include culture, arts, belief systems, worldviews, perspective in lives, traditions, governance systems, agriculture, fishing, teaching learning process, or locally known as transfer of skills among others. What is the actual picture of contextualizing in the teaching learning process? For example, Lesson 1, Week 1, Quarter 1 for a Grade 1 class. The teacher shall identify the competencies to be taught within the week and look at the indigenous learning competencies based from the IPED framework. Then, develop the so-called indigenous learning objectives. Hence, the IPED framework is so vital in this process. The teacher will write these as objectives for their lesson in the lesson plan. How do we call the lesson plans of the teachers? The lesson plans are now referred as contextualized lesson plans. It is contextualized because the objectives set are the indigenous learning objectives. And it goes as well in all parts of the CLP activities, abstraction, analysis, and application are the 4 A's. Activities and performances are based from what indigenous learners do and see in the respective communities. This makes their lesson relevant and highly relatable to them. When a learner can connect to what the teacher is saying and what activities they are performing, it captures their attention and interest. Why the level of contextualization is termed as indigenization? The contextualization process in the IPED is termed as indigenization because it involves not just the surface level only about indigenous people. Integrated in the teaching learning process is in depth that it incorporates as applicable in the IKSPs of the indigenous groups served. It is indigenization because the integration is not only about bringing local materials, indigenous props inside the classroom, but stories and even histories of this since time immemorial. Are there learning materials development for iPad implementing schools? Yes, there are learning materials development to be used by schools implementing iPad program. There are school-initiated interventions and division-initiated as well. Local stories and indigenous knowledge systems are being documented and used in the teaching learning process. How DepEd prepares teachers and school heads for this? Annually, there are retooling activities for the teachers and school heads assigned in schools in the IP communities to learn about the contextualization process. This is one of the topics discussed during the workshop to better respond to the learning needs of the learners. Teachers were taught on the appropriate activities to be done to be culturally sensitive and perform actions that are culturally appropriate. Is IP education important for the indigenous people? Of course, the indigenous people education is very important for the indigenous people to have a deeper understanding about themselves, recognize the essence of their IKSPs to their lives, appreciate more their culture and traditions, learn from numerous indigenous practices that have sustained the vibrancy of indigenous communities even in the present setup. There are many IPs, as observed, who do not know their ancestries, histories, roots, and or lineage, and even their very rich narratives. These have been considered a thing of the past and not anymore worth knowing and learning. Well, there are various reasons and factors that cause this to happen. These reasons have put layers and layers that covers accessing the very rich cultural heritage. Instead of spurring interest, it's disinterest that grow within. These and more are among the significant reasons why IP education should be sustained and strengthened. Thanking our education leaders for the very great support. Is IP education important even to those who are not members of the ICCs? IP education is not only important to those who belong to the Indigenous cultural communities or ICCs. All the more this is important to the non-IPs. Through IP education, minds and hearts have been opened that when talking about Indigenous peoples, it is not only about the dances, chants, and colorful attires. There is more to know and learn about Indigenous peoples more than just seeing them on their very colorful performances during festivals. They are people with rich history, very rich culture and traditions. As teachers, how do you promote cultural diversity? Provide positive role models for culturally diverse students. Introduce students to characters with similar experiences and emotions. Convey the richness and beauty of the diverse culture in the Philippines. Reinforce a distinct cultural identity. Promote multilingual and literacy development. Inspire learning of other cultures and general cultural knowledge. Last, facilitate acceptance of cultures different from one's own.